we're nearly 2 weeks into it now, so it's clear that this is a pretty significant operation. There's been a lot of resources devoted to it. It was quite interesting. I drove along the road towards the border. Unfortunately, we got turned away a few kilometers before we got there, and it was packed with like really, really brand spanking new vehicles. This was like the best kit that the Ukrainian army effectively have. A lot of the American, British, and Canadian vehicles, which, often if you drive out to Donbass, you see these sort of old hulks from Soviet sort of stockpiles. Well, they've really brought the full force to bear on the Kursk region. Now, the thing is, one of the interesting things is that one of the best sources we have of information from the Russian side is the pro-war Russian military bloggers who often cover this stuff in a lot of detail. They don't quite have the same sort of operational security restrictions on them as the Ukrainians have actually imposed on other journalists who are trying to report from Ukrainian controlled territory. So often in these incursions, when Ukraine is trying to maintain as much surprise as possible, they can sometimes be the best source of information, surprisingly enough.
Now, let's move on to the big story about Ukraine invading Russia. Moscow has said that Ukraine has struck and damaged a third bridge in Russia's Kursk region as it continues its incursion there. It's already damaged two bridges, a third one now. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said the country is achieving our goals. He's trying, he says, to create a buffer zone inside Russian territory. Now, I'm joined now by Tom Mutch. He's a journalist in Ukraine. He's currently in Sumy, which is the northwestern Ukrainian region from where the incursion was launched. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you very much for having me, Ed.
I'm always quite surprised the Russians are so frank about what is going on. I mean, the fact they're admitting these bridges have been blown up, but the Ukrainians seem to be enjoying extraordinary success. Everyone is very nervous about how long they can sustain it.
Yeah, so we're nearly 2 weeks into it now, so it's clear that this is a pretty significant operation. There's been a lot of resources devoted to it. It was quite interesting. I drove along the road towards the border. Unfortunately, we got turned away a few kilometers before we got there, and it was packed with like really, really brand spanking new vehicles. This was like the best kit that the Ukrainian army effectively have. A lot of the American, British, and Canadian vehicles, which, often if you drive out to Donbass, you see these sort of old hulks from Soviet sort of stockpiles. Well, they've really brought the full force to bear on the Kursk region. Now, the thing is, one of the interesting things is that one of the best sources we have of information from the Russian side is the pro-war Russian military bloggers who often cover this stuff in a lot of detail. They don't quite have the same sort of operational security restrictions on them as the Ukrainians have actually imposed on other journalists who are trying to report from Ukrainian controlled territory. So often in these incursions, when Ukraine is trying to maintain as much surprise as possible, they can sometimes be the best source of information, surprisingly enough.
And so what is happening, last time I interviewed you, you were in Kyiv. You've now travelled, as it were, to the new front line of the Kursk. But of course, everyone is now thinking that the Russians may be able to make some advances in Donetsk, which is obviously the front line that the Russians have established. Do we have any evidence about what is happening there, or whether the Russians are having to pull troops away to try and repel the Ukrainians in Kursk?
So the Russians have been making what they call slow and steady advances in Donetsk region. Well, really, they've been making them since the start of the war. This has been the one area that it's been a huge, long, slow, grinding slog where the Russians have been advancing, in some cases, literally by mere meters per day. Now, that advance, especially on the sort of southeastern city of Kursk in Donetsk region, which is an important logistical hub, has actually sped up as of late. They're getting closer to about 1 kilometre a day, and that's probably going to be the next big city that the Russians sort of try and besiege or try and treat like they did Bakhmut back last year. So it doesn't seem so far that the Russians have had to direct considerable resources from that front line so far. They do continue to make gains. A lot of people think that the Ukrainian incursion one of the reasons for doing that was sort of a political or public relations move to sort of stop this narrative of sort of overwhelming Russian firepower that will eventually grind the Ukrainians down in Donetsk, sort of, you know, throw another variable into the equation.
So one of the great advantages, Tom, even though you can't get into Kursk, is that you are on the ground. What's the kind of morale impact of what Ukraine has done? I mean, when you talk to ordinary Ukrainian civilians living on the front line, the new front line, as it were, of the Kursk, what has been the impact?
So we're in the city of Sumy now, and I should be clear, this is still, you know, to drive to the border, it's still an hour. So it's not a front line in the sense that, yes, it does get bombed with missiles every so often, and there's been missile strikes in the city. And so, but it's not within artillery range, so they can't sort of pound it in the way that they can cities that are on the real front line, so to speak. The people here sort of speak with a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, they're quite pleased that the Ukrainian army is making progress. It's exciting for them. It's a real bit of good news, finally, for once, in the last, after basically since the liberation of Kherson in 2022, there really hasn't been much great big good news to celebrate. But at the same time, they're scared because the Russians are now treating this city as sort of a staging point for the Ukrainian army and its incursion into Kursk, and they have really stepped up the bombing here quite a lot. So there's that sort of mixture of elation and hope, but also a sort of more fear for their own personal safety.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for coming on the show. That's Tom Mutch, a freelance journalist who I last spoke to a couple of weeks ago when he was in Kyiv, just as the incursion into the Kursk was launched. He's now in Sumy, which is about an hour from the border between Ukraine and Russia, giving us an insight into what is happening on the ground.
Russia carried out its third ballistic missile attack on Kyiv this month, but most of them are apparently shot down on approach, the city's military administration said on Sunday. Residents in the Ukrainian capital were inspecting the crater caused by what's believed to be a North Korean missile. Kyiv officials said there were no immediate reports of casualties in the capital. Russia and Ukraine accuse each other of striking civilian infrastructure in the war, and both deny doing so. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Saturday his troops had strengthened positions in Russia's Kursk region nearly 2 weeks into their incursion. He called for bold decisions by Kyiv's allies to allow long-range strikes. These Ukrainian soldiers are conducting drills across the border from Kursk, where Ukraine says it has seized more than 80 settlements over 444 square miles. It's the biggest invasion of Russia since World War II. Against the backdrop of that incursion, Belarus's president, a staunch ally of Russia's Vladimir Putin, spoke of a tense standoff along his country's border with Ukraine on Sunday. President Alexander Lukashenko said Ukraine had stationed more than 120,000 troops along that border, and Minsk had deployed nearly a third of its armed forces there. Russia denied a report that Ukraine's Kursk attack had derailed indirect talks with Kyiv on halting strikes on energy and power targets. A spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry denied those talks had been going on, saying no one broke anything off because there was nothing to break off. She was responding to a report in the Washington Post on Saturday that Ukraine and Russia were planning to send delegations to Qatar this month to negotiate a landmark agreement on halting strikes on critical civilian infrastructure.